I am Aaliyah Jordan, and at 32 years old, I have finally learned that blood is not always thicker than water. I am sitting here in my living room in Atlanta watching the sun set over the city I once called home, and the weight of what I am about to tell you is heavy. I just returned from my father Isaiah's funeral, and my heart is still pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Everyone saw me as the black sheep, the one who ran away to build a career in finance, while my sister Tiana stayed behind to be the golden child. But as I stood in the hallway of our family estate earlier today, my hand frozen on the door handle, I heard voices that turned my blood to ice. My sister Tiana was in the study with her husband Bradley, a man who always looked down on our community, despite marrying into it. Bradley's voice was low and calculated as he told Tiana that they had to move fast to get me out of the house before I could claim a single dime. He whispered that my father had become senile in his final days, and that he had already perfected the forge on the signature to ensure Tiana would inherit every single brick of the Jordan Empire. I stood there paralyzed, as my own sister laughed and agreed, saying I was always the outsider who deserved nothing. They have no idea that while they were plotting to steal what they think is theirs, my father had already secretly left me 2 massive farms in Georgia and a multi-million-dollar mansion in Los Angeles. Before I continue the story and reveal how I handled this ultimate betrayal, I want to know where you are watching from today. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you the most. Trust me, you do not want to miss the moment I walk through that door and change their lives forever. Growing up in the Jordan household meant living under the shadow of my father's success and my mother's crushing expectations. Our mansion in the historic district was a symbol of Black excellence to the neighbors, but for me, it was a stage where I was always the villain in Tiana's play. While Tiana was pampered and groomed to take over the family business, I was the one who stayed up late nights doing the actual work for my father's accounting while she was out partying. I remember the smell of my father's expensive cigars and the way the floorboards creaked under his heavy footsteps. He was a man of few words, but he saw everything. Even when my mother Evelyn would praise Tiana for a job I actually finished, he would catch my eye and nod. That nod was the only thing that kept me going through years of being told I was difficult and ungrateful. I left for Chicago the moment I could to build my own legacy, but the pull of family brought me back for the end. Standing behind that mahogany door today, hearing Bradley brag about his legal loopholes and Tiana's cold disregard for our father's true wishes, something inside me finally snapped. They think they are the masters of this game, but they are playing with a forged deck while I am holding the titles to the entire casino. The air in the hallway felt thin, and the scent of the funeral flowers was making me nauseous, but I forced myself to stay silent. I needed to hear every word of their plan to destroy me. Bradley mentioned the farms, saying they were worthless dirt, that he would sell off to cover his own debts. He has no clue those farms are sitting on the most valuable industrial development land in the state. I took a deep breath, smoothed my black dress, and prepared to step into the lion's den. The era of Aaliyah. The quiet victim ended the second that door handle turned. I heard my mother Evelyn's voice join the conversation, and it felt like a physical blow to my chest. She did not just agree with Bradley and Tiana, she amplified their cruelty with a coldness that only a parent can wield. She told them that I had always been the difficult child, the one who cared more about spreadsheets and interest rates than family loyalty. She called me a vulture waiting for Isaiah to take his last breath just so I could swoop in and claim the spoils of a legacy I never helped build. Hearing her words through that heavy door made me realize that the woman who raised me had never truly known me at all. To her, Tiana was the angel who stayed close to home, while I was the cold-hearted daughter who chose a career in Chicago over domestic duty. She claimed my father was delusional in his final weeks, and that he only spoke my name because I had manipulated his weakening mind. She told Bradley to make sure the paperwork was airtight because she couldn't stand the thought of me sitting in her living room acting like I owned the place. My mother even went as far as to say that my absence during the holidays was proof that I had already forfeited my place in the Jordan bloodline. I stood there in the shadows of the hallway, gripping my bag so hard my knuckles turned white. The irony was suffocating, because I was the one who had been sending money home secretly for years to cover the debts Tiana and Bradley were racking up on their luxury cars and designer clothes. I was the one who paid for the private nurses who sat by my father's bed when my mother was too busy hosting charity galas to maintain her social standing. But in that room, they painted a picture of Tiana as the selfless martyr and me as the greedy opportunist. My mother told them that Tiana deserved every cent of the inheritance because she had given up her youth to stay in Atlanta while I was out living my best life. It was a lie so grand and so polished that even Tiana seemed to lean into the performance, wiping away fake tears. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I listened to them discuss how they would present the forged documents to the estate lawyers tomorrow morning. They were so confident in their betrayal, so sure that I was just a naive girl who would take a small payout and run back to my apartment in the city. My mother's final words in that session were the ones that sealed their fate. She said that once I was gone, they could finally turn this house into the showcase it was meant to be, without my judgmental eyes watching their every move. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door and let out a silent breath. The pain was gone, replaced by a razor-sharp clarity. They wanted a villain, and I was about to give them a masterpiece. I realized then that my mother had never loved the daughter I was, she only loved the image of the family she could control. By choosing Tiana's greed over my loyalty, she had just handed me the permission I needed to take everything. I turned away from the door and walked quietly toward the back entrance, the sound of my father's favorite jazz record playing faintly in the distance. The war had started, and my mother had no idea she had just picked the losing side. I did not walk through that door. I stood in the heavy silence of the hallway for a moment longer, listening to the clinking of crystal glasses as they toasted to a future built on a lie. My mother, Tiana, and Bradley were already spending money that wasn't theirs, dividing a kingdom that had already moved beneath their feet. I turned around and walked back toward the grand entrance, my heels clicking softly on the marble floor like a countdown they couldn't hear. I slipped out into the cool Atlanta night and climbed into my car, the interior smelling of expensive leather and the faint scent of my father's cologne that still lingered on my coat. As I gripped the steering wheel, I didn't cry. I felt a cold, sharp power surging through my veins. They think they have trapped me, but they are the ones locked in a house that is about to become a very expensive prison. What they do not know is that my father Isaiah was 10 steps ahead of everyone in that room. He knew exactly who Bradley was from the moment he walked into our lives. He saw the greed in Tiana's eyes and the weakness in my mother's heart. Months before he passed, he called me to his bedside and handed me a leather portfolio. He told me that I was the only one with the strength to carry the Jordan name into the next generation. Inside that portfolio were the ironclad deeds to 2 massive farms in Georgia, totaling over 400 acres of prime land that the state has been quietly eyeing for a new green energy corridor. He also handed me the keys and the title to a sprawling mid-century modern mansion in the Hollywood Hills of Los Angeles, a property he bought decades ago that is now worth a staggering $8 million. He had shifted these assets into a private trust under my name, completely separate from the family estate they are currently fighting over. My father told me to wait for the right moment to reveal the truth, to let them show their true colors before I showed my hand. Sitting in my car, I pulled out my phone and sent a short encrypted message to my legal team in Chicago. I told them to begin the audit of the family accounts and to prepare the foreclosure notices for the secondary properties Bradley had been using as collateral for his gambling debts. They want to play the game of inheritance, but I am the one holding the deeds to the very ground they stand on. I watched the lights of the mansion in my rearview mirror as I drove away, knowing that the next time I returned, I wouldn't be the daughter asking for a seat at the table. I would be the landlord coming to collect the keys. They called me the black sheep because I chose my own path, but they are about to find out that the black sheep is the only one who learned how to build a fortress. The countdown has begun, and the payoff is going to be more than they can handle. To fulfill the family's legacy, I was always the one forced to sacrifice my dreams at the altar of their convenience. 10 years ago, I was standing in our kitchen with an acceptance letter to an Ivy League university clutched in my hand, tears of joy streaming down my face. My father's health had just taken its first major downturn, and instead of a celebration, my mother met my news with a cold, hard stare. She told me that as the eldest daughter, my place was at home to manage the household and the nurses while she maintained our social standing in Atlanta. She said my education could wait, but Tiana's could not. While I stayed behind changing bandages and managing complex medication schedules, my father's hard-earned money was being funneled into Tiana's extravagant lifestyle in Europe. They sent her to study in London and Paris, buying her a designer wardrobe and a luxury apartment, while I wore the same old clothes and lived in the small guest room to be closer to my father's bedside. It was in London where Tiana met Bradley, a man who saw our family's real estate portfolio as his personal ticket to the elite circles of the legal world. My father paid for their massive six-figure wedding, a ceremony I barely attended because I was home making sure he didn't miss a single dose of his heart medicine. I remember Tiana calling me from her honeymoon in the Maldives complaining about the service while I was scrubbing the floors because our housekeeper was out sick. My mother would boast to the church congregation about Tiana's international education and her wealthy white husband conveniently forgetting the daughter who was actually doing the labor to keep our family afloat. They treated me like a glorified servant, a shadow in the background of their perfect life. But during those long, quiet nights by my father's bed, something changed. Between his bouts of pain, he taught me the secrets of the business. He showed me how to read the hidden language of land deeds and how to spot a predator dressed in a custom suit. He watched Tiana and Bradley return home with their hands out, and he watched my mother enable their greed. He knew they were waiting for him to die, and he spent his final years making sure I was the one who held the real power. I spent a decade being the invisible backbone of this family, absorbing every insult and every dismissal, while I quietly built my own expertise in the shadows. Tiana has the degrees on her wall, but I have the knowledge in my blood. Bradley has the law license, but I have the truth. They think they can throw me away like an old tool they no longer need, but they are about to realize that I was never the servant. I was the architect. As I look back on those years of forced isolation, I don't feel regret anymore. I feel ready. Every hour I spent caring for a father who truly loved me was an hour spent preparing for this exact moment. The golden child is about to learn that gold is soft, but the iron forged in the fire of sacrifice never breaks. The following morning, I received a formal text from Tiana asking me to meet them at the estate for a family meeting to settle matters. I arrived to find them sitting in the sunroom, the very place where my father used to drink his morning coffee and read the newspaper. Bradley was at the head of the table looking smug in a tailored suit while my mother and Tiana sat on either side of him like a royal court. There was no greeting, no offer of tea, only a heavy envelope pushed toward me across the glass tabletop. Bradley cleared his throat and told me that after reviewing the family accounts, they had decided to offer me a one-time payment of $50,000. He called it a gesture of goodwill, a way to help me settle back into my little life in Chicago without feeling the burden of the family's complex financial obligations. Tiana chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy, saying that they knew how much I struggled with the pressure of the Jordan name and that this money was my ticket to freedom. My mother nodded in agreement, adding that it was best for everyone if I left Atlanta immediately. She said that since I had chosen to live my life away from them for so long, it was only fair that I let those who stayed behind manage the inheritance without my interference. The humiliation was calculated and public in the eyes of the two house staff members standing near the door. They were treating me like a distant relative who had come to beg for scraps rather than the daughter who had actually held the family together. Bradley leaned forward, his eyes cold, and told me that if I accepted this gift, I would need to sign a non-disclosure and a full waiver of any future claims against the estate. He warned me that if I tried to fight them in court, he would use every legal resource at his disposal to ensure I ended up with nothing but legal fees I couldn't afford. I looked at the envelope and then at their faces, seeing the greed masked as generosity. They truly believed I was that desperate that easily bought. My mother reached out and patted my hand, telling me to be sensible and take the win while it was still on the table. She said that Atlanta was changing, and there was no longer a place for someone with my rebellious attitude in their social circles. I didn't reach for the money. Instead, I stood up and straightened my blazer, feeling a calm power that none of them could comprehend. I told them that I would take their proposal into consideration, but reminded them that some things in this world are far more valuable than $50,000. As I walked out, Tiana called out that I should be grateful they were giving me anything at all. They think they just closed a deal, but they actually just signed their own eviction notices. The arrogance in that room was so thick it was blinding them to the truth. They want me to disappear because they are afraid of what I represent, but I am not going anywhere until every single debt is settled. Bradley shifted in his seat, the sunlight from the conservatory catching the expensive gold of his watch, as he leaned forward with a condescending smirk. He didn't just want to exile me, he wanted to crush my spirit before I left the city limits. He told me that as a senior partner at his firm, he had seen hundreds of people like me, children of successful men, who thought a minor degree in finance gave them a right to sit at the big table. He laughed a dry and hollow sound, and said that managing the Jordan estate required a level of legal sophistication and high-stakes maneuvering that I couldn't possibly grasp from my little office in Chicago. He called my career a hobby, a cute attempt at independence that paled in comparison to the complex global investments he was now overseeing for Tiana. Bradley leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper, as he told me that he had already secured the support of the local probate judges and the city's most influential developers. He warned me that if I even thought about questioning the validity of the new will, he would file a countersuit so aggressive it would bankrupt me within a month. He told me that in the world of real estate, people like him were the sharks, and people like me were just the bait. He mocked my father's old-fashioned values, saying that Isaiah had been a relic who didn't understand how to play the modern game, and that it was a mercy he had passed before he could see how Bradley was going to strip the legacy down and rebuild it in his own image. Tiana watched him with adoration, nodding as he explained that they were doing me a favor by letting me walk away with $50,000 before the real legal battles turned ugly. Bradley told me that he knew my credit score, my bank balance, and my professional history, and in his eyes, I was a non-entity. He said that a woman like me should be grateful that a man of his standing was even willing to negotiate across a table instead of just having me removed by security. The arrogance was so thick, it was almost laughable. He truly believed that his custom suit and his law degree made him invincible, unaware that I was the one who had spent the last decade auditing men much more powerful and dangerous than him. He told me to take the envelope and go back to my quiet life before he decided to take back the offer and leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back. I sat there letting him talk, letting him reveal every bit of his ego, because I knew that every word he spoke was just another nail in the coffin of his career. He thought he was the predator, but he was just a loud-mouthed intruder in a house that was already being pulled out from under him. I looked him dead in the eye and didn't blink, because I knew that in 72 hours, Bradley wouldn't be sitting at the head of any table. He would be begging for a lawyer he couldn't afford. The following afternoon, I was sitting in a small cafe near the edge of the city when my phone buzzed with a notification that made my blood run cold. It was a link to a real estate listing sent by a former colleague with a short message asking if I knew about this. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it and saw the familiar red brick exterior of the old industrial warehouse on the west side. This was not just some abandoned building. It was the place my father had given me years ago to start my own path. It was the secret headquarters where I had quietly built my investment fund and managed millions in assets away from my family's prying eyes. Before I could even process the shock, Tiana sent a group text to me and my mother with a photo of a sold sign being hammered into the front gate. She followed it with a message saying that since the building was technically listed under the family's holding company, she and Bradley had decided to liquidate it to cover the upcoming taxes on the estate. She wrote that they had sold it to a local developer for a quick cash closing, and that I needed to remove any of my junk by the end of the week. I felt a surge of cold fury because that building contained my servers, my private records, and a decade of my hard work. Tiana didn't just sell a warehouse, she tried to sell my sanctuary. She called it a worthless pile of bricks in her follow-up text, mocking the fact that I spent so much time there instead of at the country club with her. Bradley added a comment saying that the $500,000 they were getting for it was a steal and would help fund the renovations on the main mansion. They have no idea that the warehouse is actually the key piece of a 10-acre block that a major tech firm is looking to buy for $30 million next month. By selling it for scraps, they didn't just betray me, they proved they have no business running my father's legacy. I sat there staring at the screen, realizing they had no respect for the history or the future of what my father built. They saw a quick payday, where I saw a foundation. Tiana's arrogance was on full display as she joked about how she was doing the neighborhood a favor by getting rid of such an eyesore. I didn't reply to the text. I didn't scream. I simply called my head of security and told him to begin the immediate migration of our data to the cloud and to lock down the physical perimeter. My sister thinks she just made a power move, but she actually just handed me the evidence I need to prove they are mismanaging the estate. They are so blinded by their need to hurt me that they are literally burning down their own future to do it. Every step they take to alienate me is just making it easier for me to watch them fall. I am not losing that building. I am just letting them think they won the first round while I prepare for the knockout. I was still reeling from the news about the warehouse when my mother Evelyn called me back into the living room. She wasn't alone. Bradley was standing by the fireplace nursing a glass of bourbon with an insufferable look of triumph, while Tiana sat on the sofa buffing her nails. My mother didn't ask me to sit. She simply pointed to a thick stack of legal documents resting on the coffee table. She told me that the family's reputation in Atlanta was at a critical turning point, and that my presence as a potential claimant was creating unnecessary noise in their social and professional circles. She said that for the sake of the Jordan name, and to maintain the image of unity that my father worked so hard to build, I needed to sign a full waiver of inheritance immediately. She looked me in the eye without a hint of warmth, and said that my refusal to cooperate was embarrassing her in front of Bradley and his prestigious colleagues. She called me selfish for even thinking about challenging the new arrangements, claiming that my father's true wish was to see Tiana and Bradley lead the family into a new era of prosperity. When I tried to speak about the warehouse, she cut me off saying that property was a liability, and that Tiana had done me a favor by offloading it before it became a financial drain on the estate. My mother told me that if I truly loved my father, I would sign the papers, take the $50,000 and move back to Chicago quietly so the family could heal in peace. She emphasized that Bradley was a man of high standing and that making things difficult for him would only reflect poorly on me and my lack of class. The betrayal was so sharp because she was using the concept of family honor as a weapon to strip me of my rights. She told me that I had always been the child who demanded too much attention, and that this was my chance to finally do something selfless for the people who shared my blood. Bradley chimed in, reminding me that as a lawyer, he could make this process very long and very painful if I chose to be difficult. My mother nodded at his every word, treating him like the son she always wanted, while treating me like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. She said that she didn't want to see my name in the legal notices or hear whispers at the club about a family feud. I looked at the pen in her hand and realized she cared more about the polish on the Jordan name than the truth of my father's life. She told me that my silence was the only thing she required of me now. I felt the cold weight of her disappointment, But for the first time in my life, it didn't make me want to cry. It made me want to win. I told her I would take the papers to review, but she snapped that there was nothing to review unless I was looking for a way to be more difficult. She told me to sign it now to prove I wasn't the greedy girl they all thought I was. I just picked up the documents and walked toward the door, leaving her standing there fuming about the lack of respect I was showing her and Bradley. Little did she know, by trying to shame me into silence, she had just given me the final reason to speak the truth. I lowered my head and let my shoulders slump, creating the perfect image of a defeated woman broken by her mother's betrayal. I allowed my voice to tremble slightly as I told them that I never imagined my own family would treat me like a stranger in my father's house. Bradley smirked, leaning back in his chair with the arrogance of a man who thought he had already won the war. He told me that life isn't a fairy tale and that some people are born to lead while others are meant to follow from the sidelines. He started boasting about how easy it had been to fix the paperwork, laughing about how the old man was too weak to even hold a pen correctly in those final hours. He didn't realize that my hand was resting on my designer clutch, where my phone was active, capturing every single word of his confession in high-definition audio. Tiana joined in, mocking my father's final attempts to speak to me, saying that his mind was so gone, he probably wouldn't even recognize the forged signature Bradley had perfected. They were so comfortable in their cruelty, so blinded by their perceived victory, that they handed me the smoking gun on a silver platter. My mother watched them with a faint smile, adding that she felt a sense of relief, knowing the estate would be in Bradley's capable legal hands instead of mine. I played my role to perfection, wiping away a non-existent tear and asking if there was any way they would reconsider. Bradley just laughed and told me to be grateful for the $50,000 because once he was done with the restructuring, there wouldn't be a cent left for anyone who wasn't on his side. He even went as far as to describe the specific legal loopholes he used to bypass the original trust, thinking he was impressing me with his brilliance. I was actually calculating the exact prison sentence for document forgery and estate fraud as he spoke. Every insult they hurled at my character was just more metadata for the file I was building. I told them I needed a moment to breathe and walked toward the hallway, keeping the recording running until I was safely out of earshot. The air in that room was toxic with greed, but I felt a strange sense of peace. They think they are burying me, but they are actually digging their own graves. I stood by the window for a second, looking at the garden my father loved, and promised him that his true legacy would not be tarnished by these predators. Bradley's voice carried through the house, bragging about the new car he was going to buy with the first draw from the estate funds. He has no idea that the only thing he is going to be drawing soon is a court-appointed attorney. I stepped into the foyer, my heart steady and my mind sharp. The trap is set, and they walked right into it with their heads held high. Bradley leaned against the marble countertop, swirling the ice in his glass as he looked at me with a gaze that wasn't just patronizing, it was predatory. He told me that while the Jordan name meant something in the local church and the neighborhood associations of Atlanta, it carried zero weight in the global boardrooms where real power was brokered. He laughed as he looked at the family portraits on the wall, calling our history a quaint story of local struggle that had reached its ceiling. He explicitly mocked the way my father had built his business, suggesting that his focus on community development was a sentimental weakness that held the family back from true wealth. Bradley claimed that as a white man with Ivy League connections and a global legal network, he was the only one capable of cleaning up the provincial mess my father had left behind. He told me that my father's business model was rooted in a past that no longer mattered, and that Tiana was lucky to have a husband who could translate their black excellence into a language the world of high finance actually respected. The arrogance in his voice was sickening as he explained that without his intervention, the Jordan Empire would crumble within a year under the weight of its own cultural traditions. He even had the audacity to suggest that my father's reliance on handshakes and personal relationships was a primitive way to conduct business that would never survive in the modern market. Tiana sat there nodding, mesmerized by his talk of international mergers and offshore accounts, completely unaware that he was devaluing her own heritage right in front of her. Bradley told me that I was just like my father, too focused on the small picture and too tied to a community that couldn't help us reach the next level. He said that while I was playing with small-time investments in Chicago, he was positioning the family assets to be part of a global conglomerate that didn't care about our history or our skin color. He called me a relic of a bygone era and said that his presence in the family was a necessary upgrade for the 21st century. I stood there letting his coded insults and blatant disrespect wash over me, knowing that he was revealing a deep-seated contempt for the very family he was trying to rob. He spoke about the community as if it were a burden to be discarded, rather than the foundation of everything my father had built. My mother Evelyn didn't even flinch at his words, her desire for social elevation blinding her to the fact that Bradley was insulting the man she had spent 40 years with. I realized then that Bradley didn't just want the money he wanted to erase the soul of our legacy and replace it with a cold corporate version of himself. He finished his drink and told me that the world didn't need another Black-owned success story. It needed a global powerhouse, led by someone who actually knew how the system worked. I didn't say a word because I knew that the system he loved so much was about to turn its back on him. He thinks he is the savior of our legacy, but he is just the parasite that is about to be purged. I was standing near the edge of the manicured lawn, looking back at the house that had become a battlefield, when a sleek silver sedan pulled up quietly beside me. The window rolled down to reveal Marcus Bradley's lead legal assistant, a man I had seen working tirelessly in the background of every family function for the past 3 years. He looked around nervously, ensuring that the high-security cameras of the Jordan estate weren't tracking our movement. Without a word, he reached into the passenger seat and handed me a thick, unmarked manila envelope. Marcus leaned out and whispered that he couldn't stand to watch what Bradley was doing to my father's memory anymore. He told me that Bradley wasn't just a greedy son-in-law, he was a desperate man drowning in secrets that Tiana and my mother knew nothing about. Before I could even thank him, Marcus sped away, leaving me standing in the humid Atlanta air, with a weight in my hands that felt like a loaded weapon. I climbed into my car and opened the file, and what I saw inside made my jaw drop. It wasn't just corporate mismanagement, it was a paper trail of absolute chaos. Marcus had provided me with detailed records of Bradley's secret life, specifically his massive gambling debts, tied to illegal offshore sportsbooks and high-stakes underground casinos in the city. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars lost in single weekends, all of it balanced on a knife's edge. Even worse, the documents showed that Bradley had been using the Jordan family's commercial properties as hidden collateral to secure short-term loans from some very dangerous people. He wasn't just trying to steal the inheritance to be rich, he was trying to steal it to stay alive. The file contained private messages and debt collection notices that Bradley had gone to extreme lengths to hide, including rerouting mail to a private P.O. box Marcus had finally tracked down. I realized then that Bradley's arrogance wasn't born from strength, it was a mask for his absolute panic. He needed the estate liquid, and he needed it now because his creditors were no longer asking nicely. This was the missing piece of the puzzle. This was why he was so aggressive about selling the warehouse and pushing me out of the city. He was a cornered animal, trying to sacrifice my father's legacy to pay for his own vices. I felt a surge of cold clarity as I realized that the man my mother and sister worshipped as their white knight was actually the one bringing a wolf to their door. Bradley had built a house of cards on the Jordan Foundation, and I was the only one who knew where the wind was coming from. I tucked the file securely under my seat, my mind already calculating how to use this leverage. He wanted to play the lawyer, but he had forgotten that every lawyer has a discovery phase, and his was about to be devastating. I drove away from the estate feeling a strange sense of gratitude for Bradley's greed, because it gave me the exact leverage I needed to destroy his reputation and save my family from the destruction he was inviting in. He thinks he is the master of the house, but he is just a tenant with a debt he can never pay. I drove back to the estate one last time to collect my remaining personal belongings, but as I pulled into the driveway, The sight that met my eyes felt like a scene from a nightmare. The heavy rain was coming down in sheets, turning the manicured lawn into a muddy mess, and there, scattered across the wet grass, were my things. My clothes, my books, and the framed photographs of my father were all being soaked by the relentless storm. Bradley stood on the grand porch, sheltered and dry, watching with a look of pure satisfaction as Tiana tossed my favorite leather suitcase over the railing. My mother was standing just behind them, her arms crossed, her face a mask of cold indifference as she watched her own daughter's life being treated like trash. Tiana shouted over the sound of the thunder, telling me that they had already changed the security codes and that I was officially a trespasser on Jordan property. She said they didn't want the stench of my jealousy lingering in their home any longer. Bradley stepped forward, his voice loud and echoing, warning me that if I stepped foot on the porch, he would have me arrested and dragged away in front of the entire neighborhood. He laughed as he watched me scramble to pick up a box of my father's old journals from a puddle, telling me that I looked exactly like what I was, a discarded piece of a past they were moving beyond. The humiliation was total, designed to strip me of every ounce of dignity I had left. But as the rain soaked through my clothes, I didn't feel broken. I felt a strange, electric sense of liberation. My mother called out from the doorway, telling me to take my junk and never return to Atlanta, claiming that I had brought this on myself by refusing to play by their rules. She said the family was finally at peace now that the troublemaker was gone. I stood there in the pouring rain, clutching my father's journals to my chest, and looked up at the three of them, silhouetted against the warm light of the mansion. They looked so small, so desperate to hold on to a power that was already slipping through their fingers. I didn't yell, I didn't beg, and I didn't cry. I simply loaded the last of my ruined belongings into my car and looked Bradley directly in the eye. I told him that he should enjoy the view from that porch tonight because it was the last time he would ever look out over this property as its master. Tiana mocked me, calling me delusional, while my mother simply turned her back and walked inside, closing the heavy oak doors with a final echoing thud. I sat in my car, shivering from the cold, but my mind was a furnace of calculation. They think they just won the final battle, but all they did was remove the last reason I had to show them any mercy. As I drove away, the rain blurred the lights of the estate in my rearview mirror, but my vision of the future was never clearer. They wanted me out of their house, so I am going to take the entire foundation out from under them. The isolation they forced on me tonight is exactly what I need to finish this. By the time the sun rises, the hunters will realize they have become the prey. I am sitting here in my car watching the rain blur the world outside, but my mind is focused on a truth that would make Bradley's head spin. They think they just threw a broken woman out into the storm, but they actually just cleared the way for me to move without hesitation. My sister Tiana and her husband Bradley are obsessed with the mansion and the immediate cash they can squeeze from the family accounts, but they have completely overlooked the most valuable pieces of my father's legacy. Those two farms in Georgia, the ones Tiana called worthless dirt and Bradley dismissed as a tax liability, are the crown jewels of the Jordan estate. My father was a man of the soil, but he was also a man of vision. Years ago, he started buying up those specific parcels of land not for farming, but because he knew the path of progress before the surveyors even arrived. I have the confidential government documents in my secure cloud drive right now, showing that those 400 acres are the exact site chosen for the state's new multi-billion-dollar green energy corridor, an industrial tech hub. The government is preparing to make an offer for eminent domain at a premium or a private sale that would dwarf anything Bradley has ever handled in his legal career. We are talking about $30 to $40 million in raw land value alone, and that is before the development incentives kick in. My father kept this quiet even from my mother because he knew their greed would lead them to sell it off for a quick payday long before it reached its true potential. He entrusted the titles to me through a private land trust because he knew I had the patience to wait for the harvest. While Bradley is busy trying to auction off the family furniture and liquidating my small warehouse for a few $100,000, I am sitting on a fortune that could buy and sell his entire law firm 10 times over. The irony is that they could have been part of this if they had shown even a shred of humanity or respect for my father's memory. Instead, they wanted to play a game of power and exclusion. Now they are fighting over the scraps of the past while I own the foundation of the future. I am not just a daughter seeking justice, I am the CEO of a transformation they are too blind to see coming. As I look at the digital deeds on my screen, I realize that the rain outside isn't a sign of my defeat. It is the water that is going to make my father's last investment grow. They wanted me to disappear, so I will stay in the shadows just a little longer until the state's official offer hits the desk. When the news of the industrial corridor breaks, Bradley and Tiana will realize they traded a mountain of gold for a handful of gravel. The worthless dirt they mocked is about to become the site of their total financial ruin and my ultimate victory. They think I am isolated, but with this secret, I am more powerful than I have ever been. I reached into my bag and pulled out my secondary phone, the one encrypted and linked directly to my firm's high-stakes debt recovery unit. I didn't hesitate. I dialed my lead analyst, Marcus, and the line picked up on the first ring. I told him to execute the immediate recall on all outstanding private loans tied to Bradley's primary holding company. I watched the rain hit the windshield, feeling a surge of adrenaline as I gave the order to trigger the default clauses. What Bradley doesn't realize is that when he was scrambling for quick cash to cover his gambling losses and his mistress's lifestyle, he wasn't just borrowing from a faceless offshore entity. He was borrowing from me. Through a series of shell companies I built over a decade in Chicago, I have quietly become the majority holder of his personal and professional debt. I told Marcus to skip the grace period and move straight to the asset seizure phase. I wanted the notices delivered to his office, his club, and most importantly, to the front door of my father's mansion by sunrise. Every arrogant word he spoke tonight, every insult about my class and my capabilities, fueled my decision to be ruthless. I instructed my team to freeze the lines of credit he used as collateral against the family estate's commercial properties. By the time Bradley tries to make his next draw to pay off his bookies, he will find a wall of red tape and a mountain of legal demands. I am not just reclaiming my father's legacy, I am dismantling the predator who tried to feast on it. I sat back and watched the digital confirmation fly across my screen, a series of red flags signaling that Bradley's financial house of cards was starting to collapse. He thinks he is the master of the legal system, but he is about to find out that the person who owns your debt owns your life. This is the first strike in a war he didn't even know he was fighting. I told Marcus to ensure the local sheriff's office was briefed on the potential for asset recovery at the Jordan estate. I want Bradley to feel the same cold, isolating fear I felt when they threw my belongings into the mud. The transition of power has begun, and it is starting with a single devastating phone call. I am no longer the daughter pleading for respect. I am the creditor who is coming for everything he values. He wanted to play with the big sharks, and now he is about to find out exactly how deep the water goes. The hunt is on, and Bradley has nowhere left to run. I was parked just a few blocks away from the estate, watching the glow of the mansion through the rain when the first wave of panic hit inside those walls. My screen showed the real-time activity of the family's primary corporate account, and within seconds of my call, the system flagged a massive, unauthorized attempt to move funds. I could almost hear the frantic clicking of Tiana's keyboard as she tried to transfer $250,000 to a private offshore account Bradley had set up. But instead of a confirmation, she was met with a bold red notification stating that the account was frozen due to a pending debt litigation and a formal audit request. My lead analyst messaged me that the bank had just sent the official notice to Tiana's personal email and the estate's primary fax line. I sat in the darkness of my car, imagining the look on her face as she realized her digital golden goose had stopped laying eggs. A few minutes later, the lights in the mansion's study flickered, as if reflecting the chaos within. Tiana's silhouette appeared at the window, her phone pressed to her ear, her movements jagged and desperate. She was likely calling Bradley, who was probably at his club, oblivious that his world had just developed a terminal leak. The notification they received wasn't just a temporary glitch, it was a legal stranglehold. I had linked their corporate identity to the defaulted loans Bradley had taken out through my shell companies, and the bank's automated risk management had done exactly what I designed it to do. It was a domino effect they couldn't stop. Tiana tried calling the bank's emergency line, but since I had flagged the account for suspected fraudulent activity linked to the forged signature Bradley used, the operators were instructed to provide zero information until a formal hearing. The hordes of cash they thought were their birthright were now locked behind an iron door of my making. I watched as Tiana began pacing the porch, the same porch where she had mocked my worth just hours ago. The rain was still pouring, but now she was the one looking out at the darkness with fear in her eyes. She didn't have the financial literacy to understand that the freeze was just the beginning of a total liquidation. Bradley finally pulled into the driveway, his tires screeching on the wet gravel, and I could see the frantic energy between them even from a distance. They were two people who had built their entire identity on a foundation of stolen wealth, and now that the foundation was shaking, they had nothing left but their own greed to hold on to. My mother joined them on the porch, her face pale in the light of the exterior lamps, probably realizing for the first time that her white knight Bradley had led them into a financial graveyard. They looked so small, so exposed, and so utterly unprepared for a reality where they didn't have my father's money to buy their way out of trouble. I leaned back and closed my eyes, the silent hum of the rain, the only sound in my car, knowing that the real panic hadn't even started yet. By tomorrow morning, the freeze would extend to their personal lines of credit, and the house of cards would truly begin to fly apart. They wanted a fight, and now they were realizing they were unarmed. I decided to pull back into the driveway of the estate, making sure my car door slammed just loud enough to signal my arrival. I stepped out intentionally, letting my shoulders slump and allowing my hair to get slightly disheveled from the lingering mist. I walked toward the front door with slow, hesitant steps, looking every bit like a woman who had spent the night crying in a motel room. As I entered the foyer, Bradley was standing at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at me with a smirk that practically screamed victory. He walked down slowly, adjusting his silk tie, and told me that he was glad to see I had finally come to my senses and realized that I had nowhere else to go. Tiana appeared from the kitchen holding a glass of champagne and mocked my damp clothes, saying that the reality of being a nobody in Atlanta was finally starting to sink in. I let my voice catch as I told them that I was overwhelmed and that I just wanted to find a way to make things right for the sake of the family. I played the part of the broken daughter to perfection, asking Bradley if we could sit down and go over the paperwork he wanted me to sign. He laughed and told Tiana to bring me some water, not out of kindness, but to prolong the moment of his perceived dominance. He led me into the study, the air thick with his expensive cologne, and the smug energy of a man who thought he had just tamed a lion. Bradley sat behind my father's desk and told me that he was willing to be magnanimous if I cooperated fully and stopped questioning his authority. I looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes and asked for his professional advice on the small debt I had mentioned earlier, pretending I was confused by the legal terms. He leaned back, his guard completely down, and began to brag about how he had structured the estate to protect it from people like me. He was so busy enjoying my apparent submission that he didn't notice the sharp, calculating focus behind my tired gaze. He started explaining his plans for the family assets, revealing even more details about the shell companies and the offshore transfers he had initiated. I nodded along, whispering that I was just a woman who didn't understand the complexities of high-level law like he did. This was the opening I needed. By making him feel superior, I was getting him to talk without his usual legal filter. Tiana joined us, laughing about how she always knew I would eventually fold when things got tough. I apologized to her, saying that I had been blinded by my own ego and that I was ready to follow their lead. My mother, Evelyn, walked in and sighed with relief, telling me that she was glad I was finally showing some respect for the family's future. They were all so blinded by their own arrogance that they couldn't see the predator in the room was actually me. I sat there a wolf in sheep's clothing watching them celebrate a victory that was already turning into ash. Every word of praise they gave themselves was just more evidence for the fire I was about to light. Bradley leaned over and handed me a pen, telling me that this was the moment I could finally be useful to the Jordan name. I took the pen and smiled, but not for the reasons he thought. The trap was now fully primed. I leaned forward, making sure my eyes looked wide and desperate, the perfect image of a woman drowning in debt. I pushed a single crisp document across the mahogany desk toward Bradley, my hand trembling slightly for effect. I told him that if he was going to take everything else, I at least needed his signature as a witness for a personal bridge loan I was taking to save my apartment in Chicago. I whispered that the lenders were aggressive, and they needed a high-standing legal professional to verify my identity and the potential of my future inheritance scraps. Bradley didn't even bother to read the fine print. He was too busy reveling in my humiliation, chuckling as he told Tiana that this was exactly why women like me would never survive without a man's guidance. He grabbed his fountain pen with an arrogant flourish, telling me that this would be the last favor he ever did for me. He scribbled his signature across the bottom of the page, unaware that the document he was signing was not a loan witness form. It was a formal, legally binding acknowledgement of the financial discrepancies I had discovered in the estate's primary accounts. By signing that paper, Bradley was effectively confirming that he had seen and approved the very transfers that constituted grand larceny and estate fraud. He was admitting to his role as the primary architect of the shell companies he had just spent 20 minutes bragging about. I pulled the paper back toward me, clutching it to my chest, like it was my last hope for survival. Bradley leaned back, crossing his arms behind his head, and told me that he expected me to be packed and gone by the time the sun went down tomorrow. He said that once he filed the official paperwork at the courthouse, my name would be nothing more than a footnote in the Jordan family history. I thanked him with a shaky voice, standing up and backing out of the room as if I were too ashamed to look him in the eye. Tiana called out from the hallway that she would send me the name of a good cleaning service for my new, smaller life. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my car, my heart racing with a different kind of intensity. I looked at the signature on the page. Bradley had just handed me the missing link. He had signed his own confession, thinking he was merely signing my death warrant. The arrogance that he wore like a suit of armor had just become his cage. I immediately took a high-resolution photo of the document and sent it to my legal team with a single word. Green light. They think I am leaving here with nothing, but I am leaving with the one thing Bradley can't buy his way out of. Every arrogant smile and every condescending laugh from tonight is now part of a criminal record. I drove away from the mansion, the heavy iron gates closing behind me, knowing that the next time I saw Bradley, it wouldn't be in a study. It would be in a courtroom where his signature would finally mean something. He wanted to be the master of the house, but he just became the state's most valuable witness against himself. I was standing in the hallway, clutching the signed document to my chest when I saw my mother Evelyn emerge from the shadows of the master suite. Her eyes were red-rooted and her hands were trembling, but she wasn't looking at me with maternal concern. She had just stepped out of the study where she had accidentally overheard a frantic, whispered phone call between Bradley and his assistant. I watched her face, expecting the fire of a mother protecting her family, but instead I saw a woman choosing a lie over the truth. She had heard it all: the pet names, the promises of a secret life in Europe, and the confirmation that Bradley was using our family funds to keep another woman in luxury. But when she looked at me, she didn't collapse. She hardened. She marched toward me and pointed a shaking finger at my face, her voice a jagged whisper of pure venom. She accused me of being a toxic presence who was trying to poison her mind with lies because I couldn't stand to see Tiana happy. She called me a jealous, bitter woman who was inventing scandals to destroy the only man capable of saving our estate. It was a staggering display of denial. My mother told me that even if Bradley were having an affair, it was none of my business, and that a woman of her standing understood that men like him needed outlets that a difficult daughter like me could never understand. She screamed that I was trying to ruin the Jordan name just as it was about to reach the heights of Atlanta's elite circles. She told me that Bradley's personal life was irrelevant, as long as the bank accounts were full, and the invitations to the galas kept coming. The betrayal was complete. She was willing to let her own son-in-law cheat on her daughter and rob her late husband's legacy, all to maintain the illusion of a perfect life. She told me to take my vicious rumors and get out of her sight before she called the police to report me for harassment. She claimed that I was only revealing this because I wanted to feel superior, but that in reality, I was nothing but a lonely, failed woman who would never know the love of a man like Bradley. I stood there watching the woman who raised me choose a predator over her own flesh and blood. I didn't even try to show her the evidence. I realized then that she didn't want the truth, she wanted the status. She told me that Tiana was the one who truly mattered because Tiana knew how to keep a family together, even if it was built on a foundation of sand. I looked at her and felt a final cold snap in my heart. I told her that she was right about one thing: the Jordan name was about to be on everyone's lips, but not for the reasons she thought. As I walked past her toward the exit, she spat one last insult, calling me a snake in the grass who didn't deserve to carry my father's name. I didn't turn back. I had the recording of Bradley's confession, I had the signature on the fraud acknowledgement, and now I had the absolute certainty that my mother would never choose me. The fire was already burning, and she was the one who had just poured the last drop of gasoline. I was standing in the lobby of my father's former headquarters when Tiana and Bradley marched in, looking like they owned the city. Bradley waved a stack of papers at the security guard, claiming that as the new estate executor, he was there to begin the immediate liquidation of the office equipment. I stepped out from the private elevator calm and composed and told him that he was technically standing on private property leased to an outside firm. Bradley laughed, calling me a delusional girl who was playing house in a building that was about to be demolished. I simply adjusted my watch and told him that the holding company that owned this entire block had just issued a cease and desist order against his firm for unauthorized entry. The look of confusion on his face was priceless as I handed him a business card for a major investment group based in Chicago. I told him that if he wanted to sell so much as a desk lamp, he would need to speak to their primary creditor, who happened to be me. Tiana's jaw dropped as she looked at the logo on the card, realizing it was the same firm that had just sent a formal inquiry into Bradley's professional conduct. I didn't give them a chance to recover. I turned my back and walked away, letting the heavy glass doors lock behind me with a click that sounded like a prison cell closing. They were left standing in the lobby staring at a building they thought they had already conquered, while I watched them from the security monitors upstairs. Bradley's phone began to ring incessantly, likely his partners demanding an explanation for the sudden freeze on their operating accounts. The power dynamic was shifting, and they were starting to feel the first chill of a winter they weren't prepared for. Later that evening, I walked into the most exclusive steakhouse in Atlanta, where my mother and Tiana were hosting a table of high society wives to celebrate their new wealth. I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked straight to the head of the table and sat down, ignoring my mother's horrified expression. Tiana tried to hiss that this was a private event for people who actually had a standing in the community. I leaned in and told the waiter to put the entire table's tab on my corporate account, the one linked to the very bank Bradley had been begging for a loan. I looked at the women around the table and told them that it was such a shame that the Jordan family's current management was under federal investigation for estate fraud. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother tried to save face, claiming that I was just a bitter child spreading lies, but I pulled out a small high-resolution tablet and showed the woman next to her a copy of the default notice Bradley had received that morning. I told them that while my mother was busy buying vintage wine, the bank was busy preparing the foreclosure on her favorite summer house in the Hamptons. Tiana's face went from pale to a deep, angry red as she realized I was dismantling her social standing in front of the very people she lived to impress. I stood up, told them to enjoy the lobster because it might be the last meal they didn't have to pay for in cash, and walked out. The whispers began before I even reached the valet stand. I could hear Tiana screaming my name, but I just climbed into my car and drove away. Every social connection they had was now a liability. The following Sunday, the confrontation reached the steps of the historic church, where my father had been a deacon for 30 years. Bradley was trying to play the part of the grieving responsible son-in-law, shaking hands with the elders, and talking about his plans to modernize the community center. I waited until the service ended, and the crowd gathered in the courtyard. I walked up to the lead pastor and handed him a certified check for $50,000, a donation in my father's name to cover the church's mortgage for the next year. Bradley tried to step in, claiming that as the estate manager, all charitable donations had to go through him. I looked at the elders and told them that Bradley's estate manager status was currently being contested in court due to evidence of document forgery. I then turned to Bradley and asked him loudly, in front of the entire congregation, how his secret gambling debts in Nevada were coming along. The gasps from the church members were like a physical wall between us. Tiana tried to intervene, calling me a disgrace to the family, but I just smiled and told her that a real disgrace is a woman who lets a man rob her father's grave to pay for his mistakes. My mother looked like she wanted the earth to swallow her whole as the deacons began to pull Bradley aside for a private conversation. I had hit them where it hurt the most, their reputation in the heart of the Black community. They weren't the respected leaders anymore, they were the subjects of the most scandalous gossip in the city. By Monday morning, the panic in the mansion was palpable. Bradley was screaming into his phone in the study while Tiana was frantically trying to list her designer handbags on a luxury resale site. I walked into the house, no longer bothering to knock, and found them in a state of total disarray. Bradley tried to lung toward me, accusing me of sabotaging his career and poisoning the well of his professional life. I just stood there completely unmoved and told him that he was the one who poisoned the well when he chose to treat my father's legacy like a personal ATM. I revealed that I had just purchased the lien on his private jet and that the repo men were currently at the hangar. Tiana started to cry, asking how I could be so cruel to my own blood. I reminded her of the night she threw my father's journals into the mud and told her that blood doesn't give you a license to be a parasite. My mother Evelyn walked in looking older than I had ever seen her and begged me to stop the attacks for the sake of the family name. I told her that the family name was finally being cleaned of the filth Bradley had brought into it. I showed her a text message from the state's attorney office, confirming that they had received the file I sent. Bradley's face went gray. He realized that this wasn't just about money anymore, it was about his freedom. I told them that the only reason they were still in this house was because I hadn't finished the paperwork to evict them yet. Every time they tried to push back, I revealed another layer of my financial reach. When Bradley threatened to sue me for defamation, I showed him the signed acknowledgement of fraud he had given me, reminding him that truth is the absolute defense. When Tiana tried to claim that the mansion was hers by right, I showed her the original trust document that Bradley had tried to hide, which clearly stated the house was to be sold if any evidence of mismanagement was found. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, and every move they made only tightened the bars. My mother tried to appeal to my sense of duty, but I told her that my only duty was to the man she had betrayed in his final hours. I was no longer the daughter they could manipulate with guilt or shame. I was the architect of their downfall, and I was enjoying the precision of the demolition. Bradley began to realize that his legal connections couldn't save him from a creditor who had more resources and a deeper motive than any bank. He was a small man who had tried to steal a big legacy, and he was finally being crushed by the weight of it. By the end of the week, the three of them were sitting in the living room in near darkness, the electricity having been flagged for a commercial audit I initiated. They were whispering in hushed tones, terrified of what the next phone call or the next knock on the door would bring. I walked through the house, marking the items that belonged to my father's true estate, and ignored their pleas for mercy. I told them that mercy was something my father showed them for years, and they repaid him with a forged signature. Now they were going to get exactly what the law provided, nothing more and nothing less. Tiana asked where they were supposed to go when the bank took the house. I told her that there was a very nice motel on the edge of town that accepted $50 vouchers. I felt a sense of cold, righteous satisfaction as I looked at the three people who had tried to erase me. They were finally seeing me for who I really was, not the Q.U. den, but the shepherd who was taking the flock back. The transition was almost complete, and the final payoff was just hours away. I walked out of the house, and for the first time in 10 years, I felt like the air in Atlanta was finally clean. The day of the formal will reading arrived, and the atmosphere in my father's mahogany-paneled library was thick with attention you could almost touch. I sat in a lone velvet chair by the window, watching the dust motes dance in the light, while Bradley, Tiana, and my mother Evelyn occupied the central sofa like a united front of vultures. Bradley was dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit, his posture radiating a terrifying level of confidence as he placed a leather-bound folder on the desk. He didn't even look at me, treating my presence as a mere formality before he could finally claim the prize. Our family's longtime estate attorney, Mr. Henderson, looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Bradley's smug grin and my stoic expression. Bradley cleared his throat and stood up, addressing the room with his polished lawyer voice, claiming that he had discovered a revised will in my father's private safe just days before his passing. He handed a document to Mr. Henderson, asserting that this new version superseded all previous trusts and named Tiana as the sole executor and primary beneficiary of the Jordan estate. My mother leaned forward, nodding solemnly, adding that she had been a witness to my father's sudden change of heart during his final nights. She claimed that Isaiah had realized his mistake in trusting me and wanted to ensure the legacy remained in the hands of those who stayed by his side. Tiana wiped away a dry eye, whispering about how much this would have meant to our father, while Bradley began to outline the immediate steps for the transfer of assets. They were so coordinated, so rehearsed in their betrayal, that it was almost impressive. Bradley even had the audacity to suggest that out of the goodness of their hearts, they would still honor the $50,000 gift to me if I left without causing a scene. He spoke as if the deal was already closed, the ink already dry on his triumph. He started explaining the legal specificities of the forgery, framing it as a desperate act of love from a dying man who wanted to protect his favorite daughter. I watched him closely, my recording device catching every word of his public assertion that this document was authentic. He was digging a hole so deep he would never see the sun again. The arrogance in that room was suffocating, but I remained silent, letting them reach the absolute peak of their delusion. They truly believed that with my father gone, there was no one left to challenge their narrative. Bradley looked at me and asked if I had any objections before they proceeded with the official filing. I simply looked at Mr. Henderson and asked if he was ready to see the evidence I had brought. The room went cold as Bradley's smile faltered for the first time. They think they are at the finish line, but they are actually standing on a trap door. This was the moment they had worked so hard to create, and it was about to become their greatest nightmare. The real game was only just beginning. I leaned back in my chair, the sunlight through the library windows catching the dust in a way that felt like a spotlight on the tragedy unfolding. I looked Bradley in the eye and told him that while his performance was convincing, he had forgotten one crucial detail about our father. Isaiah Jordan never left anything to chance, especially when he knew he was surrounded by people who viewed his life as a ledger to be balanced. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors of the library swung open with a deliberate force. Entering the room was Mr. Sterling, my father's oldest friend, and the lead counsel for the Jordan business interests for over 30 years. Bradley's face didn't just pale, it drained of all life, as he realized that the man he thought was on a permanent retreat in the Caribbean was standing right in front of him. Mr. Sterling didn't say a word to Bradley. He walked straight to the desk, ignored the folder Bradley had placed there, and opened a sleek titanium briefcase. He pulled out a high-definition tablet and a document embossed with the official seal of the state's highest court. Mr. Sterling looked at my mother and Tiana, his voice thick with a disappointment that carried the weight of decades. He told them that Isaiah had contacted him months ago, fearing that his illness would be used as a weapon against his true wishes. He then turned the tablet toward us and pressed play. The screen filled with the image of my father sitting in this very library, looking tired, but sharper than I had seen him in years. In the video, my father spoke directly to the camera, stating the date and time and confirming his full mental capacity. He looked directly into the lens and said that if this video was being played, it meant that Bradley had attempted to use a forged document to circumvent the Jordan family trust. My father's voice was steady as he revealed that he had intentionally left a decoy will in the safe one with minor errors that only a true expert would catch, specifically to trap anyone who tried to alter his legacy. He then held up the true final will signed and witnessed by Mr. Sterling and two other pillars of the Atlanta business community. My father stated clearly that Aaliyah was the sole executor and the majority beneficiary of all liquid assets, including the Georgia farms and the Los Angeles estate. Tiana let out a strangled cry and Bradley began to stammer about legal technicalities, but Mr. Sterling cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. He told Bradley that the document he had just presented to the room was already being flagged for a criminal forensic audit. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of my father's recorded voice telling me he loved me, and that he knew I was the only one with the heart to protect what he built. I looked at Bradley, whose hands were now visibly shaking, and realized that the man who thought he was a master of the law was currently staring at a future behind bars. Mr. Sterling placed the true will on the desk and told Bradley that he had exactly 10 minutes to leave the premises before the authorities arrived to discuss the forgery. They were all frozen, caught in the light of a truth they never expected to see. The payoff wasn't just in the money, it was in the look of pure, unadulterated terror on the face of the man who tried to steal my soul. The silence in the room was heavy enough to suffocate as Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and began to read the true last will and testament of Isaiah Jordan. Every word felt like a thunderclap echoing through the library, shattering the fragile delusions Bradley and Tiana had spent weeks building. My father's voice, through Mr. Sterling's steady reading, clarified that the centerpiece of his wealth was never intended for those who viewed him as a paycheck. The true will explicitly stated that I, Aaliyah Jordan, was the sole and absolute heir to the two sprawling farms in Georgia and the multi-million-dollar mansion in Los Angeles. Bradley's hand froze mid-air, his face contorting into a mask of disbelief as the realization hit him like a physical blow. He had spent years plotting for the Atlanta estate, completely unaware that the real fortune was tied up in properties he had dismissed as worthless or non-existent. Mr. Sterling continued detail by detail, explaining that the Los Angeles mansion alone was appraised at over $8 million and was held in an ironclad trust that bypassed the standard probate process. Tiana let out a soft, strangled gasp, her eyes darting to our mother, who looked as if she had been turned to stone. The farms which Tiana had mocked as useless dirt were revealed to be the subject of a massive state development project with an estimated value that made Bradley's eyes bulge in their sockets. My father had written in the will that he was leaving these specific assets to me because I was the only child who understood the value of land legacy and loyalty. He noted that while Tiana had been given every luxury in life, she had shown a poverty of character that made her unfit to manage a true empire. Bradley tried to interrupt, his voice high and desperate, claiming that the document must be another fake. But Mr. Sterling didn't even look up. He pointed to the triple notarized seals and the digital timestamps that made the document legally invincible. I sat there perfectly still, watching the power drain out of the room. The $50,000 they had tried to gift me was now a drop in the ocean of what actually belonged to me. The mansion in LA was a fortress they could never enter, and the Georgia land was a future they would never be a part of. My mother finally spoke, her voice a mere whisper, asking if there was anything left for her. Mr. Sterling looked at her coldly and said that she would have her widow's allowance, but the control she craved was gone. I was no longer the daughter they could push into a corner. I was the owner of the ground they were standing on and the sky they were looking at. Bradley slumped into his chair, the charcoal suit that made him look like a king minutes ago, now looking like a cheap costume. The payoff was more than just money. It was the absolute destruction of their arrogance. They had tried to steal a crumb only to find out I owned the entire bakery. The D-San that was finally in the right hands. I waited for the weight of the previous revelation to settle before I stood up, smoothing out my blazer with a slow, deliberate calmness. Bradley was still staring at the floor, his mind likely racing through legal loopholes that no longer existed, but I wasn't finished. I walked to the center of the room and looked at the three of them, my mother, my sister, and the man who thought he could outsmart a Jordan. I told them that while the inheritance of the farms and the LA estate was a matter of my father's love, what came next was a matter of my professional business. I pulled a tablet from my bag and projected a series of financial charts onto the large screen at the end of the library. Bradley's eyes snapped upward, and I saw the exact moment he recognized the corporate logo of the investment fund he had been borrowing from. I explained to the room that for the last 18 months, Bradley had been taking out high-interest private loans to cover his mounting gambling debts and his failed real estate speculations. He had used the family mansion and the primary Atlanta estate as collateral, thinking he was dealing with a faceless offshore group based in Chicago. I leaned over the desk looking directly at him and revealed that the offshore group was a subsidiary of my personal holding company. "I am not just your sister-in-law, Bradley," I said. "I am your primary creditor." The room went silent as the screen displayed the total amount of his defaulted loans, a figure that far exceeded the current market value of the very house we were sitting in. I told them that, because the latest payment was 48 hours overdue, and the terms of the loan had been violated by his attempt at estate fraud, I had triggered the immediate foreclosure clause. Tiana jumped to her feet, her voice screeching as she demanded to know how I could do this to my own family. I looked at her and reminded her that she was the one who had thrown my belongings into the rain and called me a stranger. I told my mother that the safety she thought Bradley provided was nothing but a debt-ridden illusion. I have already filed the paperwork with the county, and as of 10 o'clock this morning, the title to this mansion has been transferred to my firm to satisfy the outstanding debt. You don't own this house anymore, I told them I do. Bradley's face turned a sickly shade of gray as he realized the magnitude of his failure. He hadn't just lost the inheritance, he had lost the roof over his head and the very ground beneath his feet to the woman he had spent years belittling. I informed them that the sheriff's department had already been served with the eviction notice and that they had exactly 4 hours to pack their personal items and vacate the premises. My mother began to sob, pleading with me to be sensible, but I told her that I was being more than sensible, I was being a business owner. I reminded her that she had stood by and watched Bradley insult my father's heritage and my own worth, and now she would have to live with the consequences of her silence. Bradley tried to argue that the foreclosure would take months, but I pointed to the expedited waiver he had signed when he was desperate for cash 6 months ago. He had literally signed away his right to a grace period in exchange for a lower interest rate. The financial power I held over them was absolute. I wasn't just the heir. I was the bank, the landlord, and the judge. I told Tiana to stop crying and start packing because the new owners, a local community foundation I had partnered with, were scheduled to take possession of the keys by sunset. I watched as the reality of their total displacement set in. They had tried to exclude me from a legacy I earned through years of sacrifice, and in response, I had bought their entire world and was now closing the account. I stood by the door and held it open, gesturing toward the hallway. "Your time in this house is over," I said. "You wanted me to disappear from Atlanta, but it looks like you're the ones who need to find a new place to stay. The payoff was perfect. I didn't just win the inheritance, I owned their defeat." The air in the library became heavy with the sound of Bradley's frantic, shallow breathing. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over the heavy velvet chair, his hands fumbling with the edges of the forged will, as if he could somehow rub the lies off the page. He started to stammer a pathetic, broken version of the man who had been lecturing me on class and legal sophistication just an hour ago. He looked at Tiana, then at my mother, begging them to say something, to do something, but they were both paralyzed by the sheer scale of the catastrophe. I simply checked my watch. Right on time, the muffled sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the marble foyer, followed by the authoritative voice of a man who didn't take no for an answer. The library doors swung open for the second time today, but this time it wasn't a family friend. Two uniformed officers and a plainclothes detective from the Atlanta Police Department's white-collar crime unit stepped into the room. The lead detective held up a folder and looked directly at Bradley. He stated that a warrant had been issued for the arrest of Bradley Harrison on multiple counts of first-degree forgery, grand larceny, and the embezzlement of corporate funds from the Jordan family holdings. Bradley's knees buckled, and he had to grab the edge of my father's desk to keep from falling. Tiana let out a piercing scream, rushing to his side and accusing the officers of making a terrible mistake. She shouted that her husband was a respected lawyer, a pillar of the community, and that this was all a vendetta orchestrated by her jealous sister. The detective didn't flinch. He produced a copy of the document I had tricked Bradley into signing the day before, the one where he had inadvertently acknowledged the discrepancies in the accounts. He also mentioned the audio recordings and the digital trail of the forged signature that had been verified by forensic experts during the night. The detective looked at Bradley and told him that his own lead assistant, Marcus, had turned state's witness and provided 3 years' worth of internal memos detailing his systematic theft of the estate. Bradley's face didn't just go pale. It turned a ghostly, translucent white. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and realization. He finally understood that every single move he made had been anticipated, tracked, and recorded. As the officers moved in to place him in handcuffs, Bradley began to babble, trying to shift the blame. He pointed a trembling finger at Tiana and my mother, shouting that they were the ones who pushed him, that they were the ones who demanded a lifestyle the estate couldn't afford. He called them parasites, claiming he only did what was necessary to keep the family from drowning in the debt they created. The betrayal in the room was now a circle. My mother looked at him with a mixture of horror and disgust, the man she had championed as the savior of our family, now revealing himself to be a coward and a thief. Tiana tried to grab the detective's arm, but she was firmly pushed back. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent library. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I stood by the window, watching as the man who had mocked my father's heritage and tried to steal my future was led out of the room in shame. He wasn't the shark anymore. He was just a small, broken man, caught in a net he didn't see coming. Tiana collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, while my mother stood frozen, her world of social galas and high society standing crumbling around her. I looked at the detective and thanked him for his professionalism. He nodded, noting that the evidence was so overwhelming that the district attorney was already discussing a maximum sentence to make an example out of him. As they dragged Bradley through the foyer past the portraits of the Jordan ancestors he had insulted, I walked over to the desk and picked up my father's fountain pen. I looked at my mother and Tiana and told them that the police were only the beginning. Bradley was going to prison, and they were going to have to explain to the rest of Atlanta why they had supported a criminal over their own blood. The silence that followed was the silence of a house finally being cleared of its rot. The predator was gone, and the long, cold night of the Jordan family was finally coming to an end. The chaos in the library subsided into a heavy, suffocating silence once the police car sirens faded into the distance. Tiana was no longer the poised, sophisticated socialite who had mocked my wardrobe and my life. She was a wreck of smalt-stained silk and ruined makeup. She looked around the room, realization finally dawning on her that the luxury cars, the designer bags, and the high society invitations had all vanished with Bradley's handcuffs. She turned toward me, her knees hitting the hardwood floor with a dull thud. It was a sight I never thought I would see, the golden child, the sister who was always placed on a pedestal, crawling toward me with her hands clasped in a desperate plea. She began to sob, her voice cracking as she begged me to remember that we were sisters. She claimed that she was a victim too, that Bradley had manipulated her and kept her in the dark about his crimes. She pleaded with me not to go through with the eviction, asking where she was supposed to go with no money and a husband in jail. She even tried to use our father's memory, whispering that Isaiah would never want to see his daughter on the streets. It was a pathetic display of selective amnesia. She conveniently forgot the nights she spent laughing while Bradley insulted my father's work, and she forgot the rain-soaked night she threw my belongings into the mud. I looked down at her, my expression as cold as the marble in the foyer. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out a small crumpled piece of paper. It was the original check for $10,000, part of the pittance they had tried to give me to buy my silence and my exile from Atlanta. I held it between two fingers, letting it dangle above her shaking hands. I reminded her of the moment she handed me this check, the smug look on her face when she told me it was more than I was worth. I reminded her how she called me a vulture and a beggar in my own father's house. I let go of the paper and it fluttered down, landing in the damp patch of the rug where her tears had fallen. I told her that she should keep it, as it was likely the only currency she had left in this world. I said that this $10,000 was her new life, the life she thought was good enough for me. Tiana reached for the check, her fingers trembling, but the humiliation was etched into every line of her face. She realized that I wasn't just refusing to help her. I was returning her own cruelty with mathematical precision. My mother Evelyn stood by the fireplace, unable to even look in our direction. I told Tiana to get up and find her dignity if she had any left. I informed her that the moving crew would arrive in exactly 60 minutes to clear out anything that wasn't bolted to the floor, as the house had already been sold to the community trust. I told her that while I would ensure our mother had a modest apartment and a small stipend to live on, Tiana was officially on her own. She had spent a decade living off the sweat of my father and the sacrifices I made, and that free ride had officially reached the end of the line. Tiana looked at the check, then at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and absolute defeat. She had no more moves, no more lies, and no more protectors. I walked past her, my heels clicking firmly on the floor, and didn't look back. I had spent years being the invisible support for this family, and today I finally stepped out of the shadows. As I reached the door, I told her that she should be grateful, at least I gave her a check. When she threw my things out, she didn't even give me a coat. The doors of the Jordan mansion closed behind me, leaving Tiana alone in the dark with the meager price of her own betrayal. I walked over to the large bay window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtains, letting the harsh, unforgiving morning light flood the room. My mother Evelyn flinched, as if the sun itself were an intruder. I turned to face her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see the formidable matriarch of the Jordan family. I saw a stranger whose heart had withered long before my father's ever did. I told her that while Bradley was the one who signed the forged papers, she was the one who signed my father's death warrant with her coldness. Her face hardened and she tried to snap back, claiming she had done everything she could for him. But I didn't let her finish. I reached into my bag and pulled out the private nursing logs I had recovered from the hospice staff, the logs she thought had been shredded months ago. I began to read the dates and times aloud, my voice steady and cutting through the air like a knife. I pointed to the final week of my father's life, the days when he was drifting in and out of consciousness, calling for water, calling for comfort, and calling for her. I looked at the receipts pinned to the logs, records of high-end boutique purchases in Buckhead and spa appointments that lasted for 6 hours at a time. While my father was struggling to take his last breaths, gasping in a room that smelled of sickness and neglect, my mother was 3 miles away with Tiana arguing over the shade of a designer handbag. I told her that I knew about the night the oxygen tank ran low and the nurse couldn't reach her because she had silenced her phone to attend a gallery opening. The shame finally began to crack her mask. Her lips trembled, but I didn't stop. I revealed that the devoted wife act she performed at the funeral was the ultimate insult. I had the security footage from the hallway of the house showing her and Tiana laughing and trying on jewelry in the next room, while my father lay dying just 20 feet away. I told her that the reason he left the farms and the LA estate specifically to me was because he wasn't as blind as she thought. Even in his weakened state, he saw them. He saw the way they looked at him not as a husband or a father, but as an obstacle standing between them and his bank account. I reminded her of the time I begged her to stay home for just one night so I could get a few hours of sleep, and she told me that her social obligations were more important than my melodrama. I looked her in the eye and told her that her neglect wasn't just a failure of love, it was a crime of the soul. My father died knowing that the woman he spent 40 years protecting couldn't wait for him to be gone. My mother collapsed into a chair bearing her face in her hands, but I felt no pity. I told her that she would have a small apartment and a modest allowance enough to live, but she would never again have a place in the world she valued so much. I stripped her of the title she loved most, the respected widow of Isaiah Jordan. From this moment on, I said everyone in this city will know exactly what kind of wife you were. I've ensured that a full account of your dedication during his final days will be part of the public court record during Bradley's trial. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, silent plea for mercy, but I simply turned away. I had spent 10 years being the daughter who stayed, the daughter who cared, and the daughter who sacrificed. I had given my father the only thing he truly had in the end, someone who actually loved him for who he was, not for what he owned. The justice I was seeking wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about making sure the truth of his final days was shouted from the rooftops. I walked out of the library, leaving her in the cold, bright light of her own choices. My father's spirit was finally free from the lies, and I was finally free from them. I stood in the center of the foyer, the same spot where they had stood a few nights ago, while laughing at my misery. I checked my watch. It was exactly 9 a.m. I looked at Tiana, who was still clutching the $10,000 check, and my mother, who sat paralyzed in her shame. I told them that their time had officially run out. I informed them that they had exactly 60 minutes to gather whatever personal items they could carry and vacate the property. Tiana tried to protest, her voice shrill with indignation, claiming that it was impossible to pack a lifetime of belongings in an hour. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reminded her that when she threw my suitcases into the mud, she didn't even give me 60 seconds. I was being twice as generous as she ever was. I signaled to the front door, and a team of professional movers I had hired walked in, followed by 2 private security guards. I instructed the movers to begin tagging every piece of furniture, every painting, and every heirloom that belonged to the Jordan estate. I told them that if it wasn't a toothbrush or a personal garment, it stayed in the house. Bradley's expensive suits, the jewelry he bought with embezzled funds, and the designer bags Tiana had accumulated were all being frozen as part of the asset recovery for his debts. My mother tried to reach for a silver-framed photo of her and Isaiah on the mantel, but I stepped in front of her. I told her that she lost the right to his image when she abandoned him in his final hours. That photo stays with the daughter who actually loved the man in the frame. The next hour was a whirlwind of frantic movements and hushed crying. I watched as Tiana stuffed her clothes into plastic trash bags, a poetic reversal of the luxury lifestyle she had flaunted. She had to choose between her vanity and her survival, and for once, there was no one to bail her out. Bradley's law books were being boxed up to be sold at auction, and the luxury cars in the garage were already being loaded onto a transport carrier to satisfy the bank's lien. Every time my mother tried to hide a piece of jewelry in her pocket, my security team politely asked her to return it to the velvet trays. I was being meticulous. I was being surgical. I was cleaning the rot out of my father's house. As the clock struck 10, I stood by the open front door. The rain from the previous night had cleared, leaving the air sharp and cold. Tiana walked out first, dragging two bulging trash bags, her head bowed to avoid the gaze of the neighbors who had gathered at the end of the driveway to witness the fall of the golden Jordans. My mother followed, looking small and fragile without her entourage of servants and sycophants. She stopped at the threshold, looking back one last time at the grand staircase. I didn't offer her a hug or a word of comfort. I simply took the heavy brass keys from her hand. I told them that a car was waiting at the gate to take them to the modest two-bedroom apartment I had leased for our mother. It was in a quiet part of town, far from the country clubs and the gossip of the elite. As for Tiana, I told her the car would drop her off at a bus station. I suggested she use that $10,000 check to find a lawyer of her own, because once Bradley started talking to the feds, she was going to need all the help she could get. I watched them walk down the long driveway, the same path I had walked in tears just days ago. This time the roles were reversed. I wasn't the one being discarded. I was the one taking out the trash. When the gate finally clicked shut behind them, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I had been carrying for a decade. I walked back into the house and signaled for the locksmith to begin changing every single bolt. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. The house was finally quiet, finally clean, and finally mine. I sat on the bottom step of the staircase and let out a long, slow breath. The war was over, and the Jordan legacy was finally safe. The following months felt like the slow settling of dust after a massive demolition. I stayed in Atlanta just long enough to watch the final pieces of the wreckage be cleared away. Bradley's trial was swift and brutal, a public spectacle that stripped him of every shred of dignity he had left. With Marcus's testimony and the ironclad evidence I provided, the jury didn't even need 2 hours to return a guilty verdict. He was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. The last time I saw him, he was being led away in a dull orange jumpsuit, his expensive skin fading into the gray pallor of a man who realized he would spend his prime years behind a steel door. He didn't look like a shark anymore. He looked like the thief he had always been. Tiana's fall was perhaps the most public and painful to witness. Without the estate's credit cards to lean on, her world evaporated overnight. I watched from a distance as she was forced to host a private liquidation sale in a sterile hotel suite, laying out her collection of Hermes Birkins and Chanel bags like trophies from a war she had lost. Each bag represented a year she had spent ignoring my father's decline, and seeing them sold off to the very socialites who used to envy her was a poetic justice she couldn't escape. The money didn't go to a new wardrobe. It went directly to the legal fees and the mountain of debt Bradley had left in her name. She ended up working a mid-level retail job at a department store where she used to be a VIP client, standing on her feet for 8 hours a day, finally learning the value of a dollar she actually had to earn. My mother Evelyn was the hardest to face. I kept my promise and moved her into a clean, quiet 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was a far cry from the 20-room mansion, but it was more than she deserved after her betrayal. I visited her once to drop off a box of my father's personal letters that weren't part of the estate. The apartment was silent, smelling of stale tea and regret. She sat by the window staring at a small patch of grass that looked nothing like the sprawling gardens of the Jordan estate. She tried to apologize, her voice thin and trembling, telling me that she finally understood that she had traded her soul for a social status that didn't even know her name. She admitted that she woke up every night hearing my father's voice, a ghost of a man she had abandoned for a designer lifestyle. I didn't offer her forgiveness. I simply told her that she had the rest of her life to sit in that silence and think about the man she had lost. Her late-night calls and long rambling letters of apology went largely unanswered. Some things are too broken to be mended by a late realization. As for the Jordan name, it was finally restored to its original purpose. The mansion was officially converted into the Isaiah Jordan Community Foundation, a center dedicated to providing financial literacy and legal aid to minority entrepreneurs. I stood on the sidewalk and watched as the new sign was unveiled, feeling a deep sense of peace, knowing that the building would finally be filled with the sound of progress, rather than the whispers of greed. The trash had been removed, the debts had been settled, and the legacy was finally being used to build up the community my father loved. I checked my phone and saw the boarding pass for my flight to Los Angeles. My new life was waiting for me in the hills, a life built on my own terms and protected by the wisdom my father had imparted in those final quiet nights. I had dismantled the predators, saved the inheritance, and taught my family that the QU den was the only one who actually knew how to guard the fold. I took one last look at the Atlanta skyline, then turned my back on the ghosts of the past. The war was over, the payoff was complete, and for the first time in my life, the Jordan name belonged only to me. The glass doors of my new home in the Hollywood Hills slid open with a whisper inviting the salty breeze of the Pacific Ocean into the living room. I stepped out onto the wide limestone terrace, the warmth of the Los Angeles sunset painting the sky in hues of burnt orange and deep violet. In my hand, I held a chilled glass of vintage champagne, the bubbles rising slowly like the memories of the decade I had just left behind. Below me, the city of angels stretched out in a shimmering grid of light, but my eyes were fixed on the horizon where the ocean met the sky. For the first time in 10 years, the weight in my chest was gone, replaced by the profound, quiet rhythm of true freedom. I sat down in a sleek white outdoor chair and took a slow sip of the wine, letting the crisp notes settle on my tongue. This mansion was more than just a piece of real estate. It was the physical manifestation of 10 years of silent endurance. While Tiana was sipping cocktails at country clubs on my father's dime, I was in Chicago working 18-hour days mastering the mechanics of the market and building the very fund that eventually brought Bradley to his knees. While my mother was busy curating her social image, I was the one studying the fine print of every deed and every trust my father owned. I had been the ghost in the machine, the invisible architect of my own rescue. I thought back to the nights I spent in that small guest room in Atlanta, listening to the beep of my father's heart monitor, while the rest of the family slept in luxury. I remembered the exhaustion, the insults I swallowed, and the loneliness of being the black sheep, because I refused to play their games. Every moment of that struggle had been a deposit into the life I was living now. My father knew this day would come. He had seen the fire in me when I refused to let his business crumble, and he had rewarded that fire with the keys to this kingdom. The silence here was different from the silence in the apartment I had left my mother in. Her silence was filled with regret and the ghosts of her choices. My silence was filled with the sound of the wind and the knowledge that I had done right by the man who raised me. I had protected his dignity, secured his fortune, and ensured that the Jordan name would forever be associated with power and integrity rather than greed and scandal. I pulled my phone out and saw a news alert about the opening of the Isaiah Jordan Community Foundation back in Atlanta. The image of the new sign standing tall and proud brought a genuine smile to my lips. The legacy was safe and the predators were caged. I looked at the deed to the Georgia farms sitting on the side table. Tomorrow I would sign the final partnership agreement with the green energy firm, a deal that would secure my financial independence for the rest of my life. I had turned their worthless dirt into a future they couldn't even imagine. Bradley was probably sitting in a dark cell right now, eating lukewarm food and wondering how a girl he dismissed as bait had become the shark that devoured him. Tiana was likely finishing a shift, her hands tired and her spirit broken, finally understanding that beauty is a depreciating asset, while intelligence is an empire. I raised my glass to the darkening sky, a silent toast to the man who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. "We did it, Dad," I whispered into the breeze. I felt his presence in the warmth of the evening air, a final blessing on the life I was about to lead. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I was the master of my own fate and the captain of my own soul. As the first stars began to appear over the Pacific, I leaned back and closed my eyes. The 10-year war was over. The payoff was mine. And the view from the top was even better than I had imagined. I stood at the edge of the infinity pool, the reflection of the Los Angeles skyline shimmering like a sea of diamonds beneath me. This moment wasn't just about the house, the cars, or the millions in the bank. It was about a much deeper victory, one that resonated with the history of every woman who had ever been told she was too loud, too ambitious, or simply not enough. As I looked out at the horizon, I realized that my journey was a testament to the true meaning of Black excellence. It wasn't about the flashy displays of wealth that Tiana and Bradley craved. It was about the quiet, relentless pursuit of self-sovereignty and the strategic building of an empire from the very stones of injustice. For 10 years, I had operated in the shadows, fueled by the understanding that for a Black woman in this world, financial independence is the only true form of freedom. I had watched my father build his legacy with sweat and blood, only to see it nearly dismantled by those who valued the appearance of power over the substance of character. My family tried to use my gender and my role as the dutiful daughter as a cage, expecting me to sacrifice my future to maintain their comfort. They didn't realize that every hour I spent caring for my father was also an hour spent studying the blueprints of the system they thought they controlled. I didn't just learn how to manage an estate, I learned how to weaponize the law and the market to protect what was rightfully mine. Building an empire from injustice requires a specific kind of vision. It requires you to look at a betrayal and see an opportunity. It requires you to take the worthless dirt of a forgotten farm and see the infrastructure of the future. I want every young woman who looks like me to understand that your value is not determined by the chair someone offers you at their table. Your value is determined by your ability to build your own table in your own house on your own terms. We are often taught to be resilient, to endure, and to stay humble, but I realize that humility in the face of theft is just another word for submission. True excellence is knowing when to stop being a martyr and start being a master. Financial literacy was my greatest weapon. It allowed me to turn Bradley's greed into his own trap. It allowed me to see through the smoke and mirrors of his legal threats and find the weak points in his armor. When I bought his debt, I wasn't just making a business move, I was reclaiming my agency. I was proving that a Black woman with a spreadsheet and a plan is more dangerous than a man with a title and a suit. This house in LA, the farms in Georgia, and the foundation in Atlanta are not just assets. They are a message. They are proof that you can be the black sheep and still lead the flock. You can be discarded and still come back to own the entire block. I took a final sip of my champagne, the cool liquid a sharp contrast to the warmth of the California night. The injustice I faced at the hands of my own mother and sister was meant to break me, but instead it forged me into something unbreakable. They chose to be parasites on a legacy they didn't build, while I chose to be the architect of a future they can't even touch. Black excellence is not a destination. It is the courage to define yourself when the world tries to define you by your utility to others. It is the power to say no to crumbs because you know you are the owner of the harvest. As I walked back into the living room of my mansion, I felt the presence of my father in every shadow. He didn't just leave me money. He left me the blueprint for self-reliance. I have built a fortress here, not to hide from the world, but to engage with it from a position of absolute strength. My mother and Tiana are living the lives their choices created, while I am living the life I engineered. This is the payoff for every tear shed in secret and every insult taken in silence. This is what it looks like when a Black woman decides that she is no longer for sale. I am Aaliyah Jordan, and my empire is just getting started. I was standing in my study, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the canyon, when my private laptop chimed with a high-priority notification. It wasn't a message from a debt collector or a local lawyer. It was an encrypted invitation from the global heritage conglomerate, one of the most powerful investment entities in the world. I sat down and opened the file. They weren't just contacting me to offer a deal. They were proposing a strategic partnership to oversee their entire North American sustainable development portfolio. They had seen the move I made with the Georgia farms, and they recognized the surgical precision with which I had liquidated Bradley's firm. In the eyes of the global elite, I was no longer just a Jordan heir. I was a sovereign power. The letter explicitly stated that they had been watching my maneuvers for years. They admired the way I had weaponized my exclusion to build a shadow empire, and they wanted my vision to lead their next decade of growth. The contract attached had more zeros than the entire Jordan estate was worth at its peak. It was the ultimate validation, a signal that my father's legacy was merely the launchpad for a trajectory that would take me far beyond the borders of Atlanta or the social circles of the Hollywood Hills. I felt a surge of cold, focused energy. Everything I had endured, the rain, the insults, the isolation, had been the training ground for this exact moment. Just then, my personal phone lit up on the desk. A flurry of messages appeared on the lock screen. It was Tiana begging for a loan to cover her rent, followed by a long, rambling voice note from my mother about family forgiveness and the trials we all had to face. I didn't open them. I didn't even feel the urge to delete them. To me, they were now just background noise, the fading echoes of a world that no longer had any claim on my time or my spirit. I picked up the phone, and with a single smooth motion, I swiped the notifications into oblivion and powered the device down. I turned back to the large monitor, the GHC logo glowing in the dim light of the room. I had spent 10 years playing defense, protecting a dying man and a tarnished name. Now, for the first time in my life, I was playing offense. The pieces were all in place, the capital was secured, and the world was finally paying attention. I walked over to the camera mounted on my desk, the one I used for high-level board meetings, and watched my own reflection in the lens. I didn't look like the girl who was kicked out in the rain. I looked like the woman who owned the storm. I leaned forward, a ghost of a smile playing on my lips, my eyes sharp with the promise of what was to come. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was the architect of a new era. I looked directly into the camera, speaking to the future I had built with my own hands. I spoke with a voice that was no longer a whisper, but a command. "You thought you saw the end of the story," I said, my voice steady and cold. "But you were only looking at the prologue. The debts have been settled, the trash has been cleared, and the foundation is finally solid." I straightened my blazer and tilted my head slightly, the lights of Los Angeles shimmering behind me like a crown of electricity. This is only the beginning. I reached out and cut the feed, the screen going black, leaving the room in a perfect, powerful silence. My new life didn't start tomorrow. It started right now. The core lesson of Aaliyah's journey is that financial sovereignty is the ultimate shield against betrayal. In a world where even blood ties can be corrupted by greed, her victory proves that strategic patience and professional competence outweigh inherited status. She didn't just survive an injustice, she engineered a comeback by mastering the systems used to oppress her. For women, especially those underestimated by society, the story highlights that knowledge is the only asset that cannot be stolen. True power lies in building your own foundation so firmly that no one can ever evict you from your worth. If you're ready to stop playing by their rules and start building your own empire, subscribe now to master the art of the ultimate comeback.